Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest segment of Affecting Change, EFF's live stream series where our panelists tackle the latest issues in civil liberties and digital rights, and human rights, in technology and the digital world. My name is Jillian York, and I'm the Director for International Freedom of Expression at EFF, and I have the honor of opening the space for today's discussion. Before we proceed, we have just a few housekeeping items to go over. First, we will be recording this session, but only video of our speakers will be included. You can join us now in the official chat via Twitch by going to eff.org/livestream. In the Twitch chat, you can drop your questions throughout the program, and our guests will answer as many as they can at the end. If you're comfortable, we encourage you to type a hello in the chat window now and let us know from which part of the world you're joining us. We also have a live caption team online with us today, and you can view those captions at livestream.eff.org. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF is a nonprofit composed of technologists, activists, and attorneys. Since 1990, EFF has been fighting for your right to create, innovate, and make yourself heard by anyone willing to listen without fear of unjust government or corporate surveillance. You are the reason that EFF can take on this important work. If you'd like to help us in the fight to defend your digital freedoms, please consider donating at eff.org/supportchange or picking up some cool EFF gear at shop.eff.org. So, with the housekeeping out of the way, it's my honor to introduce the participants in today's discussion. Elena Castillo Jimenez is a feminist human rights lawyer working at the intersection of human rights, surveillance, and public policy. She's currently the Advocacy and Policy Advisor at Amnesty Tech Security Lab. Elise Auerbach is a member of Amnesty International USA's Country Specialist Program. Her area of expertise is on Iran, and she also leads the Refugee Casework Committee for Amnesty USA. Elise holds a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. And she's been a member of Amnesty International since 1987. Paige Collings works as senior speech and privacy activist at EFF, where she focuses on highlighting how state surveillance and corporate restrictions stifle marginalized communities and perpetuate historic injustices and harm. Alongside her work at EFF, Paige is a board member at the European Digital Rights, EDRI, and sits on the Advisory Committee for Litigation Grants at the Digital Freedom Fund. As a reminder, we'll have about 15 minutes for your questions at the end, so if we haven't touched on something that you want to hear about, please just ask. You can submit your questions via the Twitch chat at any time. And finally, we'll also be sharing some resources as we go along so you can learn more about the topic from EFF, Amnesty, and our other allies. So, let's get started. I'd like to start by giving our viewers a sense of how widespread internet shutdowns are. When Egypt shut down most of its networks in 2011, that was the first time that many people had even learned that this was possible, even though it wasn't the first shutdown. Since that time, researchers at organizations like Access Now have documented hundreds of shutdowns in at least 55 countries. Some are short-lived, others last much longer. Paige, can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about EFF's work on shutdowns and how people around the world are impacted by them?
Yes, thank you so much, and welcome everybody for this Affecting Change. So I think just to position ourselves as we begin, what we're talking about when we discuss internet shutdowns is essentially an intentional disruption of internet or electronic communications. In doing so, it renders these services ineffective or unusable or inaccessible. It's quite broad, and there are lots of different categories that will fall under that. Access Now detailed this in a taxonomy of internet shutdowns, where they categorized it from the worst case, which are blanket shutdowns, which are essentially cutting off access altogether, slowing down access to the internet through throttling, or blocking communication platforms like messaging apps. There are lots of different types that get implemented and for different purposes too. Gillian mentioned there a few circumstances upon which we've been documenting internet shutdowns over the years. We see this happening in times of warfare, in times of conflict, and as a group today, we'll be discussing that in a little bit more detail. But we also see it for circumstances around elections and cheating on exams. And so we see countries like India and Kenya have imposed internet shutdowns or blocks on certain services online to prevent cheating for young people when they're taking exams in schools. And so it's a big category. There are various categorizations, and essentially what's sought to achieve here is that people shouldn't find information or share information with one another. And so what we're seeing is a restriction on accessing information, crucial information that can be indeed finding answers to an exam, or how to stay alive during a circumstance of conflict. In terms of Iran, and that's probably why many of you are here today, we've seen over the last few months that almost the entire population have been deprived of internet access. For earlier this year, it was for 3 weeks, almost 90 million people deprived of any internet access. And so what we're seeing here is that this is a fundamental attack on human rights. When people are disconnected from the internet and from telecommunication services, it really impacts all facets of life, from work to education, and indeed in this way, to stay alive. These are essential mechanisms to restrict free speech, prevent community organizing, circumvent any attempts to organize protests, and fundamentally block journalism. If you can't document and get information out of a country or a certain geographical area, then it's very difficult to hold people accountable for that. And so at EFF, we've been working on this for many years. Most recently, we've been looking at how internet shutdowns have been affected in Gaza, how there we've had a physical attack, or well, an attack on the physical infrastructure of telecommunication services, as well as an attack on the actual communication service itself, through disruptions, through denials of services, through blockades of fuels. And so this is a really broad circumstance. There are lots of organizations working on this. Today you'll hear from us at EFF and colleagues at Amnesty. We also have colleagues at organizations like Access Now, Hamler, who recently launched a campaign to reconnect Gaza. And essentially all of these initiatives align around one idea, which is urging governments to restore internet connection to ensure that it's not a battle in any internal or external conflict.
Thank you, Paige. That's really helpful background. Elise, I want to turn to you to give us more of the broader picture of what's been happening in Iran. So we know the shutdown isn't the first of its kind, although I think it is the longest so far. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do things look like in Iran otherwise? How does the government control media and the internet? And how does this latest shutdown fit into that broader pattern?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, the government of Iran has been engaged in a long-term project, a multi-pronged project, to both restrict the information that citizens of Iran can access, and also to police and restrict the information that Iranians can share, both with each other and with the outside world. So this, as you said, this internet shutdown has actually been the longest. It's been over 1,000 hours now. It's the most recent iteration of the shutdown actually started right after, hostilities between Israel and the United States and Iran. There was actually an earlier shutdown in January, which allowed the Iranian authorities to massacre thousands of people in the streets mostly during the course of a couple of days in January 8th and 9th, and we'll probably never know the number of people who were massacred in the streets. But there was also an internet shutdown in June of 2025. There was an internet shutdown during protests in 2019. So internet shutdowns are not a new thing with the Iranian government. But for many years now, the Iranian authorities have been massively surveilling and policing their population. There is a cyber police force known as Fatah, which actually monitors the internet use, the social media use of the population. And in addition, the Iranian authorities have been trying to require people to use a national information network, which is basically a government-controlled network that is separate from the World Wide Web, so that it could only allow people to have access to certain government-approved information. And the government has actually used people's internet communications, their communications on social media platforms such as Instagram and Telegram and so forth, to charge them with severe national security offenses if they, for instance, criticize the government. And also, more recently, they've really cracked down on people who have tried to circumvent the internet shutdowns by, for instance, using or selling or distributing Starlink equipment. And also people have been arrested for selling VPN, virtual public network technology. So they've really been cracking down on people who have been trying to circumvent the internet shutdowns. And also they've been characterizing communications on the internet. They've characterized attempts to distribute Starlink and other technology as part of a plot to undermine national security, to collaborate with hostile states such as Israel and the United States, to engage in espionage. And a number of people, a very large number of people, have been arrested, and people have been executed as well. In the last few months, people have been executed if they've been accused of obtaining payment in cyber currency for instance, allegedly sharing information with enemy media outlets such as Iran International, or even just taking pictures of, for instance, damage from bombs in their community and sharing those pictures on their social media networks.
Thank you. That's just a horrible and also such a great overview of what's happening right now and giving us that picture. I really appreciate it. Elena, can you tell us what do you think the government is hoping to accomplish with this particular shutdown? How does that play out?
Yeah, thank you, Jillian, and thank you, Paige and Elise, for offering such a comprehensive overview as well, and for the opportunity to touch on this topic. I think when we look at what's going on in Iran and the current internet shutdown, what we can see patterns. I mean, as Elise was mentioning, there's especially 3 key moments in the last few years where we have seen internet shutdown significantly taking space in Iran. 2019 with the protests that happened then, in 2022 with the Women Life protests as well, and currently, as Elise mentioned, in December, this massive protest started to take place in Iran, especially in Tehran, and continued through January. And this is when we start to see a significant use of internet shutdowns that has continued ever since, with different iterations. So the first one, when you look at the context, the first reason why a government, in this case the government of Iran, will be interested in cutting down access to internet or throttling or manipulating how much and how often people can make use of the internet, is clearly an operational cover, right? Like there is an intent of preventing human rights violations and information about what's happening currently from being documented. That obviously perpetuates impunity, that perpetuates barriers and access to information, facilitates communications that we have been seeing since, again, at least 2019, but it's just taking place in a more pervasive way now. When one is not able to verify and document what's happening on the ground, and if we are on the ground, if we're not able to communicate with each other and with the world what's going on and inform the people what's happening, it has an immediate impact, obviously, on journalism and the exercise of freedom of expression, but it also has impacts on other human rights as well. And as long as a government can control the flow of information, obviously there's like an incentive there when what's happening on the ground is pretty dire. The second reason why this is unfortunately an appealing tactic for Iran and many governments around the world is disrupting communications, especially in moments of tension. In Iran now, we're seeing it trying to blockade efforts to coordinate protests and to coordinate the exercise of freedom of peaceful assembly and other legitimate exercises of human rights. But then we've also seen it in other countries around the world where in moments of like elections or political tensions, governments or the authorities or other institutions feel the need to cut access to information and therefore intervene with access to internet. I mean, we've seen it in several instances around the world, but just speaking about Iran in particular, documenting the control and, you know, the physical attacks, the unlawful use of force, the potentially unlawful killings by security forces, the manipulation and control of protests, and intervening on the exercise of freedom of peaceful assembly is one goal that internet shutdowns can contribute to achieve if a government is trying to achieve that. And I think the third one, which is not always spoken about, but that is also another important point to have in mind, is the narrative control that comes with that. Like, as I mentioned earlier, there's a level of control of information that can be facilitated when you control the access to the internet. And in the context of Iran, that has its own domestic internet as well, and that has invested significant resources and time into developing an infrastructure that will allow it to control what is said and what isn't said and how and to whom. I think that there is definitely an interest there in controlling the narrative. And obviously with all the intersecting impacts that this have, right? Like in general, internet shutdowns have incredible impacts, not only in the immediate rights that I mentioned, which are like the most obvious when you look at the conditions of where it is happening, but it also has economic impacts. It also has gendered impacts, right? Like who are the most impacted when you're not able to access the internet? It's typically the most marginalized individuals and the most targeted individuals. So these are the several reasons why we believe, a government like Iran will be interested in conducting one of the longest internet shutdowns we've seen in the country.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive answer. So I want to ask, and I'm kind of going to throw this to all of the panelists, despite all of this and despite all of the very real risks, despite the shutdown, we're still seeing some Iranians able to get online. What do we know about some of the ways that people on the ground are finding to get around the blackout and still access the internet? Anyone like to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I can give it I can start. So I think and I see there's one question in the chat as well mentioning VPNs, and so I think we can take that. And it's already mentioned Starlink and satellite. So I think those two tools have been used or spoken about a lot. And the incredible organization FilterWatch has done a lot of research into both of those. So the deployment of VPNs and Starlink as satellite internet. I think essentially what we're looking at here is that there are pockets of connectivity that have been available throughout these blackouts, and leveraging those pockets has enabled internet access to become almost a luxury commodity that's really expensive. And so in trying to curtail internet access throughout the stack, expanding the scope and scale of any blockout, the authorities in Iran have tested the boundaries of what's available for them to host and what's not. And so what we're actually looking at here are a few things, and without getting into too much detail, because I know the question didn't necessarily talk about that, but I think it's quite an interesting moment with this specific blackout because there are a number of things going on. So white SIM cards, which are kind of unrestricted privileged SIM cards, they were disconnected, which essentially the state has stripped internet access from its own trusted insiders to prevent any leaks. At the same time, SMS services have been cut off, cellular and landline services are also being cut off. But we also have a whitelist policy that's been developing, which is essentially transforming the internet from an open public platform to a system of predefined control. And so where that leaves us with tools like VPNs is that if people were able to download them ahead of time, because it's very difficult to download a VPN during any kind of blocked service. But if people were able to download those ahead of time, and the blackout was as such, then they could have been functional. And I think when a shutdown is limited to a certain geographical area or a certain service provider, or more specifically just one specific platform, which then a VPN can be quite a functional utility in enabling to reroute that connection through a different website or through a different location. And so in that scenario, we've seen that. Witness have released some information that notes that each gigabyte, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong, each gigabyte of VPN access that can connect users has been sold between essentially $6 to $24, which is 5 to 20 times higher than the global average for 1 gigabyte. And so we look again at Starlink and we see that the similar colleagues from Witness have published that these terminals, Starlink terminals, satellite terminals, are being sold for around $2,000 per terminal. And so whilst there are these tiny pockets that have enabled people to connect and remain connected, it's very expensive and it's not sustainable and it's not comprehensive for getting all the millions of people in Iran back online. And so whilst there have been these small glimpses of people being able to remain online through the VPNs or through Starlink and satellite imagery, I think that's probably one of the big ones, although Elise also mentioned that there's been a huge crackdown on that. And as of the war between Iran and Israel last year, this using satellite imagery was criminalized, and so any kind of judicial or security actions against the use of satellite imagery, satellite internet use, was elevated. And so we're seeing that there are pockets of being able to remain connected, but it's not comprehensive. It doesn't always work, and if it does, it's extraordinarily expensive.
Thank you, Paige. That's really helpful, and I appreciate getting to some of the technical questions because it sounds like those are burning questions from the audience. I'm going to turn to Lena next. What are some of the most promising policy or technical interventions right now to prevent or mitigate shutdowns globally?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think following up from what Paige just said before jumping into that question, I think those efforts, I would like to acknowledge, they speak to the resilience of so many individuals, not only in Iran, but in other parts of the world, supporting in order to make sure that people still have access to the internet, because as Paige was mentioning, it's not always just a complete blackout. Sometimes it can just be targeted, but at the same time, if it is a complete shutdown, as we are in different ways witnessing, there's not that much that VPNs or other tools that typically help can do. And I think that also is important to flag, because it also speaks to how quickly a government can adapt to counter circumventing techniques. And so one of the most promising technical proposals that I can speak to, and is coming from some of our colleagues in other organizations, Access Now, Witness, the Center for Human Rights in Iran, if I recall correctly, is the concept of direct to cell platforms. So as Paige was mentioning so far, connections to Starlink and other ways in which people can access internet has worked to a certain degree. But then, as Elise was also mentioning earlier, individuals can and have been targeted. Those are being enabling the setup of Starlink connections on the ground in Iran. But these organizations have come together along with others to propose that, as developers and manufacturers of cell phone and mobile phones and the developers of internet resources and infrastructure continue to develop this possibility of a device being able to just connect to the internet directly, as the name indicates, being able to expand that and expand the access to it, especially for humanitarian context and conditions as what we're witnessing in Iran, could be an alternative that is more durable, that is more resistant to agile adaptability by a government or an institution that has the resources to invest in learning quickly from this and figuring out how to block it, but also facilitates access in general, right? Like, it doesn't imply, like Paige was saying, that you're already prepared and knowledgeable about this, that you already know what VPN to download, etc., which is not always the case if you're not an individual that has access to these networks to begin with. And then on the policy level, I wanted to flag, the foundation already exists. When you look at the international law and international human rights law in particular, already it has been recognized that internet shutdowns violate human rights, point blank, period. And that is not a tool to be used by government. It is using it is a violation of their obligations under international human rights law. And we can argue about the treaties and the sources of the obligations, but in general, when it comes to Iran being a member of the international community, of course, this is also applicable for them as a government. I think the gap, as we're seeing it, is in enforcement. Organizations like Amnesty and others have already called for comprehensive international justice approaches, have already elevated, EFF, Access Now, and others in partnership with, local organizations and allies on different around the world. Acknowledging the fact that it is already enshrined as a standard, but it's still being used, and not only is being used, it is increasingly being used. So we're not seeing necessarily an improvement on that. So how can we make sure that internet shutdowns are costly, reputatively, legally, diplomatically, so that it is not a tool that continues to be as attractive as we're seeing it? I think is the question that I think we all got to ask ourselves. Like, we already have the foundations, legally speaking, for that, but how can we make sure that they're actually enforced?
Thank you. No, that's so important. And I actually want to ask a follow-up to that. In light of all of that, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to go directly to you, Alina, anyone can jump in on this one, but what do you think explains then the global rise in shutdowns over the past 15 or so years? Because it does sort of feel like it also coincides with the advocacy against shutdowns.
I could just give a quick overview, and please, Paige and Elise, if you have thoughts, come in. I think it also coincides with the rise of individuals having more and more access to the internet and using it to coordinate themselves and share information, and just the evolvement of this new concept that is not new to us anymore, but at the time of like, how do we guarantee and enjoy human rights in the digital space? Because we're not only talking about physical spaces. So I think that as governments have realized that that potential is there, for as much as there's potential for quote unquote development, as it has been called oftentimes, especially in UN fora, of like the realizing access to internet as an indicator of development, at the same time, well, the more people are online, then the harder it is for us to track. And we see this in other issues that we all grapple with in the digital rights world, right? But I think that is one indicator for me of like, oh, this might be one of many reasons why we are seeing a rise as well. And obviously when you pair that with the rise of authoritarianism trends around the world for the last few years, I mean, I think it speaks to the merge of tactics when it comes to transnational repression, digital authoritarianism, and access to internet as well.
Thank you. Elise, I want to come back to you and ask, since you follow Iran closer than the rest of us do, what are you seeing in terms of what Iranians, including throughout the diaspora, are demanding regarding the internet?
Well, again, Iranians want to be able to communicate freely. I think one thing is that the Iranian authorities are not viewing the internet as a public good. I mean, in the last several years, access to the internet, being able to use the internet, has become essential basically for life in most sectors. But the Iranian authorities are not seeing it as a public good. Instead, they're increasingly seeing it as a privilege that is predicated on what they would consider to be sanctioned and approved conduct. So, for instance, recently, the shutdown of the internet has actually had a lot of economic consequences because people have not been able to conduct business, through the internet. So the government has actually been working on establishing a system that would allow certain economic actors to access sectors of the internet that would be necessary to conduct economic activity, because the government is actually concerned about the economic situation in Iran, which has been increasingly dire over the past several months. But in order to be able to access the internet, in order to conduct economic activities, these people need to register, they need to be vetted, they need to, and the understanding is that they will be monitored, strictly monitored during the course of their use of the internet. So instead of being seen as a right, only people who agree to the government's very strict terms are going to be allowed, would be allowed to use the internet. So this is a huge major problem. And, again, over the years, the Iranian people have been playing a sort of cat and mouse game with the government. Every time the government imposes internet censorship, the population has been trying to figure out ways of getting around it. Talking about Starlink and VPN, again, it's being, there was a major bill passed by the Iranian parliament in the fall, which imposes new punishments on people who are actually distributing Starlink and also using Starlink. And in recent new legislation that's been proposed, selling VPNs, virtual private networks, will be criminalized. And actually, people have already been arrested for selling VPNs. But one big problem is that Iranians in Iran have been, have used platforms such as Telegram, Instagram to express themselves, to talk about their vision for the future, which may not align with the Iranian government's vision for the future, and they've been severely punished. And some people have actually been executed because of postings that they've made on their Telegram channels, for instance. Iranians around the world have had a great deal of trouble communicating with their loved ones. Again, during the massive human rights violations that occurred in early January, we were only able to get kind of like pinpoints of information when people, for instance, would be able to send out images of themselves trying to find loved ones in massive morgues where people were sort of walking through piles of body bags. So you only were able to get little points of information about what was really happening, because the government obviously did not want the world to know about the scale of their human rights violations.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, I think next, I'm just monitoring the audience questions I'm seeing. We've got a lot of technical ones coming in. That's fantastic. We'll try to get to those soon. I do have a couple more, and I'd like to broaden this out just a little bit beyond Iran towards internet shutdowns globally. Now, we've talked about it a little bit, but Paige, do you feel like, are you seeing internet shutdowns becoming a normalized tool of governance rather than an exceptional measure?
Yeah, sadly, that's like exactly the case. And so I think Alina mentioned earlier that the internet is essentially the modern public public sphere. So much happens online now, and with the greater use of the internet means that there's a greater potential for governments and authorities to curtail information and access to communities by denying this access. And so I think what we're seeing is an expansion of scale and scope over the last 20 years of how those who have access to cutting this off or to reducing access of specific platforms, services, and indeed internet access throughout the stack are utilizing that. And to pick on something Alina mentioned, I think what's also fascinating is how this is also pushing the parameters on the application of international human rights regulations and mechanisms and legislation on regional provisions that protect rights both online and offline, because what we're seeing is that all of this is absolutely contrary to many of the international human rights standards that most of these countries have signed up to, or the companies that are providing services adhere to, and yet that doesn't happen. And so I think what we're in this moment where we're seeing how the internet can be used to disrupt democracies as well as destabilize dictatorships. I mean, we saw many years ago how Facebook was able to engage in political exploitation with Cambridge Analytica, how Russian hackers have previously targeted US voter rolls. We're looking now at the current shutdowns in Iran, and I mentioned earlier how shutdowns have been leveraged to great success if you're the Israeli government on Gaza. As Alina mentioned, we can call this digital authoritarianism. I think that's probably the best answer to your question of, are we seeing this normalized? Absolutely. And it can fall under this theory, which is essentially, ways that governments can control their citizens through technology by kind of inverting this idea that the internet is an engine or a facility for human liberation and connection, and instead are doing the opposite. And Freedom House, an organization called Freedom House, have done some brilliant research into the idea of digital authoritarianism. So if you're interested, we can connect that. But essentially what we're looking at here is controlling the access to information, both within countries and how we can share that out. And even looking at conversations about VPN access, Starlink, we've spoken about it a lot, but even when these are being provided by people, it's at great personal cost. It's not easy, physically it's not easy, and then on a broader level, it's not easy. It comes with such great implications for both personal and community safety. And yet people are still doing that. I think to broaden that out slightly as well, what we're seeing is just this normalization of surveillance and censorship, which I know both at EFF and Amnesty we work on all the time. It's a fundamental part of our work and our advocacy, which is to permeate through this. I think what we're seeing a lot is this broader curtailing of free speech through crackdowns on information that's being shared. And since the escalation of the conflict between the US and Israel, Iran, we've seen this also kind of spill out in related attacks across the Gulf, with several governments kind of intensifying and proliferating efforts to silence dissent and, most importantly, restrict the flow of information internally and with the outside world. And by that I mean outside the geography or the jurisdiction that these restrictions are happening within. We saw very recently news that an award-winning journalist and television host, Ahmed Shihab al-Din, was arrested in Kuwait earlier in March and charged with spreading false information, I think harming national security, and misusing his phone number for sharing footage of a US airstrike into his Substack. And so we're seeing this retaliatory framework upon which censorship and surveillance is leveraged by those law enforcement and government agencies. And war and conflict just makes it so much easier for these agents to justify the intense crackdown on speech and information sharing. And so I think as conflicts will continue to, and I think most importantly, what's crucial to mention here is that this is not new. We have seen forever law enforcement and government agencies restrict populations for whatever purpose that they intend to, but now they have a vastly expanded capacity to do so through shutting down the internet in whichever way that happens. As I mentioned earlier, whether it's through an entire block, whether it's through throttling, whether it's through preventing access to VPNs or to certain platforms, or indeed whether it's by arresting and detaining journalists for sharing disinformation. And in wartime, that's just greatly amplified because public interest is expanded. People need to find out how to stay alive, never mind what's going on in their communities. And so, yes, there's a normalization, but it's part of this broader, I think, a broader idea of how both democracies and authoritarian regimes are currently functioning.
Thank you. I want to come to a question. This kind of gets to a question that's been coming up a lot in the audience. What are some of the things that people can do to prepare for internet shutdowns, but maybe also a little bit more broadly for government crackdowns of other kinds? And I think we'll throw some resources out here too. Alina, do you want to kick that one off, and other folks can add to it as well?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, I know that the loom or the threat of internet shutdowns is becoming very real, especially for people that maybe never expected it to experience it in other jurisdictions. So I want to start by what should be done beforehand. Like, we need to stay active just on the policy and advocacy side, and then we can touch on the technical sides. First of all, we need to continue to advocate for internet connectivity, and we need to make sure that it is not normalized as if it is a thing that is given to us and could not be taken away, not just in jurisdictions like Iran, but also in other parts of the world. So I think I wanted to start by that, because I feel like a lot of people that I speak to that are not in our world constantly believe that it is a given and that it cannot be intervened with. So advocating not just with governments, but also with internet service providers, companies that are part of this. The other one is in preparation for potential internet shutdowns. Like we mentioned, there is a trend that we have, all of our organizations are verified around the world, by which we notice a connection, if not a correlation, between a crackdown on freedoms and the shutting down of the internet. So improving our tactics and our abilities to document and collect evidence on what might be happening on the ground before the internet is shut down is critical, because like we mentioned, one of the biggest challenges / one of the biggest goals pursued with an internet shutdown is to cut communications and cut people's abilities to let others know what is going on, share videos, audio, images, text on what's happening in my neighborhood, what's happening in my city, in my country. So improving that as well is critical. And then Paige mentioned on this part as well, and I wonder if maybe Paige might want to add, but on the technical side, it might sound like very essential or like beginner level for some of our audience here, but just in general, I think people should be informed about what a VPN is and what are the different options that can be used, and just have them downloaded and be ready on your mobile devices, on your laptops, and everything that you use, just to be ready, because you don't know. Seriously, I mean, we've seen it even in other parts of the world when you might wake up and things have just radically changed and you need it. So.
Yeah, maybe I can just add one thing to that, which is that we have a guide on our surveillance self-defense, so ssd.eff.org. I think we can put the link in the chat. And that is on choosing the right VPN for you. And so it will take you through what kind of risks you have, where you're located, what potentially you could need a VPN for, what a VPN really is, and then it gives some suggestions. And so indeed, getting ahead of it whilst you still have the ability to download something like a VPN is essential, and you can use that guide as a good place to start.
Thank you. That is fantastic. Yeah, and we will continue to throw out some more links into the chat as we see these things come up. I want to ask also, maybe Paige, maybe we can start with you on this one. Are there any ways that viewers can get involved in the movement against internet shutdowns, either technically or in terms of advocacy?
Yes. So I see I've been checking the chat and I think we have quite a lot of technical questions. And so what I would do is I would implore those that understand how this works to, if you have the time, energy, and resources to get involved, because I think documenting what's happening is such a fundamental element of knowing how we can take action. Knowing what's happening, determining how a shutdown is being carried out, and then figuring out who might be behind that. Is an essential place to start. And so that's if you have the ability and tools to do that, that's great. We can then move on to the protection of people. And so those, I mean, Alina and Elise also mentioned it, but providing VPNs, internet access through Starlink or satellite is at great cost for a lot of people. If you're able to contribute to that in whatever ways, we've seen eSIM. I mean, this is slightly different, but we've seen eSIM schemes of sending, people donating to provide eSIMs to places like Gaza over the last few years. And so that's something you can do. If you work in policy or a civil society group or a community group that wants to get involved in advocacy, there are UN guiding principles of business and human rights, and then the OECD guidelines on kind of multinational entities. And these provisions require that there is due diligence implemented, so companies, know the impact of their services on human rights. And so there are a lot of advocacy-related, a lot of administrative initiatives that we can do, and that's what we at EFF do. And we've mentioned already organizations like Access Now, Witness, doing a lot of this through the Keep It On campaign. And so if you are within this space and maybe you're part of the Global Network Initiative, GNI, these provide kind of established principles for companies to follow. I think that can be really helpful as well, because I think one thing that we've maybe not touched upon right now is why are services complying with these shutdown requests? And beyond the idea of the actual towers being bombed, which we are seeing also, there are just requests to stop services or abilities to stop services. And we know that kind of services, ISPs, they will comply with shutdown orders because they're afraid of government retaliation, or they're afraid of a kind of a loss of service to their entire network. And so there are lots of kind of capacity related issues there that we can work to enhance, to get people back online. I think the goal here is to get people back online and prevent shutdowns in the future. And we've seen some great success with that. The Keep It On campaign, that coalition has had some great success in restoring internet access over the years, and getting governments to promise essentially not to do it again, to not do it around the times of elections or exams, and to utilize different tools to remedy the harm that they perceive is happening. And so I think there are a lot of those things. And then I guess finally what I will say is UNI, ONI, people can also measure internet censorship. And again, this is a community effort to ensure that we're aware as possible, whilst people are not experiencing shutdowns ourselves, that we can track what's happening. And UniProbe enables people to kind of run tests and document evidence of various network interferences. And so we can do things from the comfort of our internet related service. And indeed, if you're in certain regions, making sure that you can protect yourself as much as possible, building out community tools. So if the internet does get shut down, then you're aware of who you can contact and how you can get in touch with them. Downloading a VPN on the off chance that it might be functional if there is a shutdown, and taking those precautions as much as possible, where possible, knowing that it might not work if there is an entire blackout, but at least just familiarizing yourself with what could or should happen in that case.
Thanks, Paige. Elena, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, thank you. I think going back to the question also, like what can people do about it? I think there's a question as well for other members of the community on like what else can be done from the technical aspect of things. Like also the technologies here following the streaming and just following on internet shutdowns more broadly. Like yes, VPNs and other tactics can be effective, but as we mentioned, are limited. So what else can be done and what else can be developed from the technology's perspective, from the manufacturer's perspective, from even the internet service provider's perspective, to ensure access to internet even when an institution or a government wants to intervene. So I mentioned earlier that a proposal has been put forward by some of our colleagues in other orgs like Access Now, Witness, Article 19, Center for Human Rights in Iran, to strengthen and develop this direct-to-cell satellite technology. It's as a way to ensure that, as most smartphones nowadays, should be able to use this technology if the infrastructure continues to be developed, and that if more investment in this is put forward so that individuals can connect to the internet without having to rely on the systems that we're currently using, especially again in a country like Iran, where you also have to deal with the domestic intranet that they have put in place and that we've seen in other countries around the world as well. So I think this is also, I'm curious to hear from technologists and experts from that side on like what else do we think can be done? Because I think from the policy side, if we can combine the human rights standards that we already have, like internet connectivity is a right. So internet shutdowns are a violation of that right? But the actual goal is to ensure that people maintain access to the internet. So what are the technical aspects that are required to realize that go beyond policy, and we can partner up and hopefully develop better tactics to survive the increase of the use of internet shutdowns. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and just to the audience, we are seeing your questions. We're not ignoring them, but we're also very cognizant of the fact that this is a panel of policy folks, lawyers, and so we will hold these questions. We will share them with our technical teams, and hopefully we can find a way to answer them either on one of our blogs. But don't worry, we're not ignoring you. We just wanted to flag that. Elise, I want to come back to you on, again, bringing the conversation back to Iran where we started. What are ways that people who are watching this can, what are things, that people who are watching this can do to either to help people in Iran stay connected or just to support people in Iran right now?
Well, I think one thing that's really important, as Alina was talking to, is the issue of international accountability, holding the Iranian authorities accountable. And actually, I was very happy to see that last month, the current special rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Iran, Mai Sato, actually had a whole section on internet shutdown, on restriction of information that's available to Iranians, also restrictions on the ability of Iranians to communicate. There was a big section on that in her report. So I think that's a very important recognition. That's a very important recognition that that what the Iranian authorities are doing is actually a serious violation of human rights. So I think we have to keep this as it's a human rights violation. It's a human rights issue that people have the right to both access information and also share information. So right now, one big problem is that the Iranian penal code characterizes all kinds of expression of opinion as potential national security violations. So if you express your disagreement with what the government is doing, if you express support for LGBTQ rights, if you express support for women's rights and so forth, you can be charged with very severe national security charges just for putting those opinions out there on the internet, putting those opinions on your social media channels such as Instagram and Telegram. And also the government will actually target people, will post threatening and menacing messages on people's platforms if they're criticizing the government in any way. So I think we really need to encourage the international community to hold the Iranian authorities accountable. And also we have to look at systemic problems with Iran's constitution, for instance, Iran's penal code, that allow for what we would consider the peaceful expression of a person's opinion to be characterized as a serious national security threat, which can be punished by many years in prison, even up to and including execution. So these are all things that we need to do as an international community to hold the Iranian authorities accountable, and also to bring about important systemic changes in the Iranian system.
Thank you so much for that. Excellent. We've got a little bit more time, and a couple of questions just came in that are a little less technical, so I'm going to try to throw these to the panel. I think I will start with this second question that I've got here, which is there an organization out there, and I know there is, but are there any resources we want to throw out there that focus on providing know-how and resources to help people overcome not necessarily shutdowns, but other internet regime-imposed access restrictions and the blocking of communication apps?
Yeah, I can just jump in and say, I think
Sure.
many of our organizations and the organizations that we've mentioned, so Access now have been leading with a lot of work on internet shutdowns. I think we've shared a few links in the chat today from filter organizations that are doing some fantastic work on internet shutdowns and blockages, like Filter Watch. Witness have some guides on what people can do. Amnesty Tech and Amnesty have developed. So I think, unfortunately, that it's not consolidated in one place, but it is around. I think what we can do as a group, we can think about how we can share this in an effective way after this this discussion, and we'd be happy to share it out so it's a little bit easier for a consolidated list of resources. But a lot of the time it's circumstantial, and I think that's the thing with something like a shutdown, is that it's contingent on a certain geography or a resource. I mean, the idea that within that question, I think, could be something like age verification mandates. And if you're a young person trying to access a certain website, and if you're somebody based in Iran trying to access the internet after a full shutdown and all services are blocked. And so I think we can try and get to that. But I think if you go to each of the websites that we've mentioned today, I'm sorry it's a bit laborious as an answer, but there should be some information there. I don't know if Alina or Elise have further elucidations on that.
Yeah, I will maybe just add, there are many organizations, as you mentioned, Paige, with different resources, but also in general, I think it helps to think about internet shutdowns specifically, because there are many ways to control what circulates on the internet, but specifically on internet shutdowns, which is what we're talking about today. It's helpful to think about it as a tool that has definitely a connection with authoritarian practices, but it's not exclusive of what people might consider as a quote unquote regime or authoritative government. Like many other countries around the world across the political spectrum have made use of this tool in some shape or form, whether it is reducing how much internet and how much you can actually use, or throttling a complete blackdown or a shutdown. It can be geographically limited. It doesn't have to be the entire country. It can be focused on what websites you have access to. So I think it helps when you think about it like that to identify it. This is just an indicator of an authoritarian practice, a violation of human rights. And in this context, what can we do about it? And connecting to what Elise mentioned earlier as well, so what can we do to resist it? I think listening and collaborating with the people that have been impacted by it is really critical. So obviously in this case, listening to and partnering up with Iranians is critical, but also in general, if we're talking about developing global tools to resist this trend, it will be imperative to work with those that have been most severely impacted by it.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. We are getting close to time, so I want to kind of turn it back to the panel and say, is there anything else that you really want to make sure that our viewers know about this trend and about what's happening right now? Any sort of final comments on this?
I think maybe just that if you're in a region or an area where you are experiencing shutdowns, that there are, just to jump on what Alina just mentioned, there are organizations and people that are available to try and help and assist. And we acknowledge that in those perilous moments, it's not very easy to, it may be impossible to communicate, but we are here to take advice and guidance and work rather than from our way to to the other reverse. We're here to always think about how we can better help and assist as organizations working for a better tech future. And so we want this to be continual conversations about how we can do better to support and how we can better assist people who are in regions that are being impacted by this. Sharing and documenting examples and evidence is one thing, and we can do that through the protection of our organizations rather than it being often an individual that might face quite extensive ramifications for doing that. And so, yeah, I think it just a call out that if you are experiencing something or you're connected to people that might be, then feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be really happy to have those conversations and see how, if there's anything that we can do, from threat modeling on an individual level to answering the very technological questions in the chat, which we will get to. I know many of our colleagues will be delighted to take those questions. To better bridging that gap of information. We're really happy to do all of those things to make sure that people can remain online and stay connected.
Thank you. Yep, and as Paige mentioned, we will get some resources out to you for everyone who registered for this call. We'll be sending out some resources, and hopefully we'll be able to get some answers to some of those technical questions as well. Well, I think we are getting close to the end, so I just want to thank everyone, Elena, Elise, and Paige, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who contributed to the discussion in the chat, all of the great questions, including the ones that we will answer in the future, and to everyone who's watching around the world. I think we're all very lucky to have internet connectivity. We've said it before, and I'll say it again, digital rights begins with you. EFF has been a leader in privacy, freedom of expression, and innovation for 35 years, and we need your help to keep up the fight. So please take 10 minutes now to become a member if you're not already at EFF.org/support-change. And please continue these conversations about your civil liberties with your colleagues and friends. Share Amnesty's work, EFF's work, and we've got all those other great links for you as well. We work with a lot of allies from around the world. And once you're done renewing your EFF membership, be sure to mark your calendar for the next segment of Affecting Change, which will be on May 14th. We'll be talking with Cory Doctorow about his latest book, Shittification, one of the best words of the last year, diving into how the internet sucks and, while you didn't do it, how you can make it better. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.